Impossible. These figures are impossible.
This is unacceptable.
June 12th, 1943. 08:15 a.m. Tokyo Imperial Navy Headquarters. The air in the war room was heavy with cigarette smoke, the kind that clung to uniforms and stung the eyes. Outside, the city roared with the clatter of streetcars and the drone of practice flights overhead. But inside, the chamber silence hit like a wall. A single folder, still warm from the courier's hands, lay on the polished table. The crimson seal of secrecy cracked as Admiral Tanaka broke it open, and within seconds, his knuckles turned white. The report claimed something impossible in the Boeing plant near Seattle. The Americans were producing heavy bombers at a pace that mocked every principle of Japanese military science. Hundreds each month rolling off assembly lines as if they were mere automobiles. Tanaka's pulse hammered as he scanned the numbers again, willing them to be a trick. They weren't. His voice caught in his throat as he muttered, "If this is true, we are already finished." Around him, younger officers exchanged uneasy glances, the shuffle of boots echoing against the wood-paneled walls. Some smirked in disbelief. Others clenched their jaws. For years, they had been told Americans were lazy, decadent, incapable of endurance. Yet here was evidence that their enemy had bent democracy and diversity into an engine of war. The contradiction was unbearable. A nation they despised as weak might be producing more machines of destruction in a single month than Japan could build in a year. And still, Tanaka knew the real battle would not be fought in the skies, but in the minds of those who refused to believe. He closed the folder with trembling hands. The question was no longer whether the intelligence was true. The question was whether anyone would dare accept it. Admiral Tanaka did not lift his eyes from the paper as the room stiffened around him. The silence grew unbearable, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the distant rumble of artillery practice across Tokyo Bay. He cleared his throat, a rasp that betrayed more than age. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice low, but sharp enough to cut the air. "This report claims that in Seattle at the Boeing plant, the Americans are producing 300 B-17 Flying Fortresses each month. At peak, one bomber every 70 minutes leaves the line." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. One of the younger officers let out a scoff, quickly silenced by Tanaka's glare. He spread the documents across the table, rows of typed figures, intercepted letters, shipping manifests. The numbers did not waver, no matter how often his eyes returned to them. They formed an iron wall of arithmetic, and behind that wall lay a truth Japan was not prepared to face. He pressed his finger against the page. 300 bombers, each carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs, each with 4 engines, each engine a masterpiece of horsepower. If this is correct, and every line points to it, then we face an enemy whose factories move faster than our dreams of conquest. We thought America was slow. We thought democracy was chaos. But this report says otherwise. It says we are standing on a shrinking island of illusions. A murmur rippled across the chamber. Commander Ito, a rigid believer in imperial propaganda, shook his head. "Impossible. A bomber is not a bicycle. They lie to frighten us." Tanaka slammed his fist onto the table. The coffee cups rattled and the smoke seemed to swirl as if pulled by the force of his conviction. "Do you think I want to believe this? Do you think I would risk my career, my honor, by presenting fantasy? Look at these manifests. 40 million pounds of aluminum, shipped west in 3 months. Steel, by the trainload. Their railroads pulse like arteries, carrying the lifeblood of war. They are not bluffing. They are building." He remembered the first time he had seen American industry with his own eyes, years earlier as a naval attaché. The scale had unsettled him. Even then, assembly lines stretching farther than temple courtyards, machines stamping steel like gods, molding thunder. Now, Those memories returned sharper, more menacing. America had not grown weaker since then. It had awakened. The younger officers fidgeted. Some avoided his gaze. Others narrowed their eyes, as though sheer disbelief could tear the reports to pieces. But Tanaka pressed on his voice, rising with each word. Understand this. If these numbers are true, then every calculation we have made collapses. For every plane we destroy, 3 more will replace it. For every factory we bomb, they will build 2 more. Our pilots fight with courage, but courage does not multiply steel. He paused, letting the words echo in the wood-paneled room. He could see sweat trickling down the temples of men too young to admit fear. He could see the weight pressing on their shoulders, the unspoken terror that they might already be fighting a war that could not be won. Captain Morimoto, pale and tight-lipped, finally whispered, "If this is true, Admiral, then the war is already lost before the great battles have even begun." Tanaka closed his eyes for a moment, the admission slicing through him like a blade. "Yes," he said softly, "that is what this report means. We are losing to arithmetic. We are losing to a factory." The chamber erupted in low arguments. Some insisted it was Allied trickery. Others muttered that such production was physically impossible. The clash of denial and dread filled the air like clashing sabers. But Tanaka raised his hand, silencing them once more. "You think it is impossible because you measure the enemy with our rulers, but you forget who they are. These Americans built skyscrapers that touch the clouds in 2 years. They throw bridges across rivers wider than our bays. They are not bound by the same limits. They train women, Negroes, even children, barely 16, to work machines. To us, this is unthinkable. To them, it is democracy. Every citizen becomes a soldier of industry." His words struck like hammer blows. The prejudice and pride that had long shielded these men from fear now cracked under the weight of his conviction. A vision burned in Tanaka's mind. Endless lines of silver bombers rising into the sky, blotting out the sun, each one born from a factory that never slept. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a grave whisper. "Gentlemen, if America can build bombers the way it builds cars, then our empire stands on sand. Every fortress we raise will crumble. Every fleet we launch will drown under their shadow." You ask me if I believe this report. I tell you if I do not. We will perish, doubly first, in ignorance, then in defeat. The officers sat frozen, some staring at the floor, others locked on the papers, as if the numbers might vanish if ignored long enough. The war room no longer smelled of smoke and coffee. It smelled of fear. Tanaka straightened, gathering the documents into a single stack. "I will send this to the High Command," he said, "but I know what answer I will receive. They will laugh. They will call it propaganda. They will cling to their belief that democracy makes America weak. And when the sky burns with swarms of bombers, they will still be asking how it happened." His eyes swept the room, landing on each officer in turn. "Remember this moment. Remember that we saw the truth first. We stood at the threshold of reality, and we recognized it. Others will not. They will choose lies over arithmetic. They will call defeat impossible even as it lands upon their cities. But history will not care for their pride. History will count only the bombers." The clock ticked on. Outside, the drone of practice flights faded into the distance. Inside, the officers sat in a silence, deeper than before. A silence weighted with the knowledge that a storm was gathering, one built not of clouds, but of factories and steel. Tanaka let the final sheet fall back into the folder, his hand trembling slightly. He felt older than his years, burdened not just with the war, but with the certainty that the truth he carried would be denied. Yet he also felt a strange clarity, as if he had stepped through a veil and glimpsed the end before it arrived. 300 bombers a month, he repeated the words more a sentence than a statistic. If this stands, then our empire's fate is already written. The officers said nothing. The numbers said everything. The folder lay shut before Admiral Tanaka, but the figures within refused to remain silent. They echoed in his skull, each number a drumbeat of doom. Yet even as his officers sat paralyzed in disbelief, new reports arrived from beyond the Pacific, carried through secret channels that spanned continents. What Tanaka had read was only the beginning. 2 weeks earlier, in a dimly lit cafe in Mexico City, German agents had overheard a careless American oil executive boasting after too many tequilas. Now, Japanese intelligence intercepted the same whispers from across the ocean. A Spanish diplomat passing through Washington wrote to Madrid of a factory so vast that clouds gathered beneath its ceiling. A Swedish engineer, stunned by what he had seen on a company tour, described assembly lines that stretched longer than Tokyo's main avenues. Each account from different lips and different languages pointed to the same impossible truth: the Americans were building bombers as if they were toys. The reports read like fragments of a nightmare, yet they fit together with terrifying precision. In Detroit, merchants told of rail cars loaded with aluminum vanishing westward day after day. In Los Angeles, a Japanese agent posing as a shipping clerk reported that entire trains of machine tools were bound for Seattle. And in San Francisco, dockworkers spoke of crates stamped Boeing so massive they required cranes, each shipment feeding an insatiable industrial hunger. One agent's account was almost poetic in its horror. He had walked the floor of the plant during a guided tour arranged for neutral businessmen. "Gentlemen," he wrote, "what I saw defies the imagination." Women with scarves tied around their hair leaned over the skeletons of bombers riveting steel with hands that had yesterday cradled infants. Negro workers in overalls operated machines the size of houses, their movements as precise as any master craftsman. Boys barely out of school carried blueprints, shouting instructions with the confidence of generals. The factory is not a workplace. It is an army with walls. Tanaka pored over these words with a sinking heart. He knew his fellow officers would dismiss them as exaggerations, yet the details were too consistent. Different men in different cities repeated the same astonishing images. Subassemblies arriving like rivers, wings flowing from one direction, fuselages from another, tails from a third, converging at precise points along the line. The factory did not build bombers. It birthed them, one after another, a ceaseless procession of steel giants. From Argentina came confirmation. A businessman sympathetic to Japan had met with a Ford representative in Buenos Aires who bragged of America's miracle factories. The man repeated in disbelief that Ford trained 8,000 workers every week in a dedicated school, many of them women. They were taught their single task in days, sometimes hours, then set loose on the line. Perfection through repetition, the representative had called it. The phrase reached Tokyo like a curse. The Swedish engineer's letter was worse. "I have seen the future," he wrote. "It is not Europe. It is America. Their machines are not merely tools. They are extensions of the nation itself. They possess more than 1,600 specialized devices, each designed for a single purpose. The capital investment is beyond calculation. I doubt even Germany could imagine such extravagance. Yet to them, it is routine." Tanaka read these lines aloud to his staff. Each word felt like a blade pressed deeper into his chest. "Do you understand?" he demanded. "This is not rumor. These are witnesses. Spaniards, Swedes, Argentines, all telling the same story. The Americans have built a temple of war industry, and its god is production." Still, the room resisted. Commander Ito sneered. "A temple, no admiral, a stage. The Americans are actors. They parade these factories before foreigners, hoping to frighten us into submission. The numbers are theater." Tanaka's hand trembled as he held up the Swedish report. Then why do the numbers match? Why does the Spaniard describe the same mile-long assembly line as the Mexican? Why do the Argentines repeat the same figure? 42,000 workers, 11,000 women, thousands of Negroes. These men do not conspire. They have no reason to lie to us. The truth is converging from every direction, just as the bombers converge on their runways. He could still picture it as clearly as if he had been there himself. Rows of women in coveralls riveting the skins of giants under the glow of overhead lamps. Black smoke curling toward skylights, as machines screamed through aluminum sheets, boys running along catwalks with clipboards, an ocean of humanity bent to a single purpose. This was not the weak democracy the empire mocked. This was something else entirely, a force born from diversity, fueled by urgency, disciplined, not by chains, but by choice. From Turkey came another whisper. A Japanese officer in Ankara reported that American envoys boasted of monthly outputs exceeding Japan's yearly totals. The Turks, skeptical but intrigued, passed the figures quietly to Japanese handlers. Again, the numbers aligned. By now, the evidence formed a noose around denial. 17 separate reports from 5 nations, each confirming the others. The conclusion was inescapable, and yet Tanaka knew it would be dismissed. He remembered the mocking laughter of Goering in Berlin when German intelligence had brought similar news, the contemptuous wave of Hitler's hand. He feared his own high command would do the same, choosing comfort over truth. He closed his eyes, hearing the phantom roar of engines. 300 bombers a month, he whispered again, each one a fortress of steel. If they are real, then the Pacific itself cannot hold them back. The room fell still. Even Ito could not muster another insult. The tide of evidence was rising too high, too fast. Pride alone could not dam it. The officers exchanged glances uneasy, their certainty eroding grain by grain. They had mocked the first report as propaganda. But when Spaniards, Swedes, Argentines, Turks, and even careless Americans repeated the same impossible vision, doubt began to gnaw at their defenses. Tanaka gathered the reports once more, his voice hardening. We will deliver this to the High Command. We will tell them that democracy has turned its people into riveters, machinists, engineers. We will tell them that the enemy builds bombers faster than we can count. Whether they listen or not is no longer in our control. But the truth will stand, and when the skies darken with steel, no one will say we were not warned. The folder snapped shut. The chamber was silent, but beneath that silence lay the thunder of engines from across the ocean. For every whisper, every intercepted letter, every boast over drinks, a picture had formed. A factory larger than their imagination, a workforce broader than their ideology, could accept a storm of bombers already assembling in the American self. Sky. The reports had spoken. The truth was no longer a rumor. It was a fact undeniable, and it was closing in. The reports lay in Tanaka's hands like burning coal. He carried them through the long corridors of the Imperial Navy Ministry, past officers who bowed stiffly, past clerks who avoided his eyes as though the papers themselves whispered of ruin. Every step echoed with dread. He knew what awaited him, not the acceptance of truth, but its burial beneath pride. When he entered the high command chamber, the air was already thick with arrogance. Grand maps sprawled across the walls, crimson arrows stabbing outward into the Pacific, while miniature fleets of painted ships dotted the seas. The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and certainty. Generals in immaculate uniforms leaned back in their chairs, their laughter sharp as blades, their eyes gleaming with the self-assurance of men who had never doubted their empire's destiny. Tanaka placed the folder on the central table and bowed. Excellencies, I bring intelligence reports confirmed by 17 separate sources, foreign and domestic. They concern American aircraft production. The chief of staff barely glanced up from his cigar. Another phantom report? Very well. Amuse us. Tanaka's voice hardened as he opened the folder. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, they are producing 300 B-17 bombers monthly, at peak 1 every 70 minutes. Witnesses from Spain, Sweden, Argentina, and Turkey have confirmed this. Shipping manifests align with the figures. If these numbers hold, the Americans can replace their losses 3 times over while we struggle to replace 1. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then the laughter began. It was not the laughter of joy, but of contempt, a chorus of derision that struck Tanaka like whips. One general leaned forward, smirking. A bomber, every hour, absurd. Perhaps they will next claim to build battleships in their bathtubs. Another officer tapped the table with a jeweled finger. This is propaganda, Admiral. The Americans excel at theater. They invite gullible foreigners to staged factories, show them wooden mock-ups, and send them home with tales of miracles. And now you bring these fairy stories here, as though we are children in need of ghost tales. Tanaka's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to shout, to drag them into the factories with his own hands, to force their eyes open to the storm gathering across the ocean. Instead, he kept his voice steady, though it trembled with rage beneath the surface. "With respect, sir, these are not fairy stories. These are reports from multiple nations, all independent. Spaniards describe mile-long assembly lines. Swedes count 1,600 specialized machines. Argentines record 42,000 workers, 11,000 women, thousands of Negro laborers. Even American businessmen speaking in their cups confess to the same figures. These are not phantoms. These are facts," the Chief of Staff snorted. "Negroes and women. Do you truly expect us to believe that such inferior stock could produce war machines of quality? A bomber is no sewing machine. It demands skill, discipline, dedication. Qualities that belong to us, not to them." The words landed like acid on Tanaka's skin. He could feel the weight of ideology pressing down, crushing logic beneath its boots. He saw it. In their eyes they could not believe, not because the evidence lacked weight, but because belief would shatter the foundation of everything they had been taught. To accept that women with scarves tied in their hair, Negro workers with calloused hands, and boys still learning to shave could outproduce the empire's finest artisans was unthinkable. It was not a question of intelligence, it was a question of pride. Tanaka spread the manifests across the table, each page heavy with ink and certainty. "These are shipping records of aluminum millions of pounds monthly consumed by a single plant. We cannot even mine that much in 6 months. If these numbers are false, then explain the shipments. If these photographs are fabrications, explain the thousands of cars parked outside the shadows of aircraft through skylights, the rows of bombers ready for delivery. If this is theater, then it is theater greater than anything the world has ever staged." The generals glanced at the photographs, at the typed reports, at the evidence, staring them in the face. Some looked uneasy, their eyes flickering with doubt. But the louder voices smothered them. "It is trickery," one barked. "Photographs can be manipulated. Foreigners can be bribed. Numbers can be inflated. You insult the empire with this defeatism, Tanaka. The Americans are mongrels, incapable of unity. Their democracy is weakness. Their diversity is decay. They cannot achieve what you claim." Tanaka's rage boiled over. "Then you choose blindness. You sit here among your maps and your dreams. But the enemy does not fight with dreams. They fight with steel, with machines, with an army of workers who do not care for our theories of purity. They build with every hand available while we chain ourselves with arrogance. If we continue to ignore this truth, then the day will come when our skies are blackened by thousands of bombers, and we will be left asking how it happened when we knew all along." The room erupted in shouts. Some called him a coward, others a traitor. One officer spat the word defeatist like a curse. But Tanaka saw in the eyes of the quiet ones the spark of recognition. They knew he was right, though fear bound their tongues. The Chief of Staff leaned forward, eyes cold. "Enough, Admiral. You bring us tales of American miracles and expect us to abandon our strategy. You mistake your duty. An officer does not spread panic. He spreads confidence. Your words reek of defeat. We will not hear them." Tanaka bowed stiffly, but inside his chest, fury roared. He gathered the papers, knowing they would be locked away, buried under official silence. As he turned to leave, one young officer whispered, almost inaudible, "But what if he is right?" The word struck Tanaka like a final blow. He did not answer. The truth was already spoken, and truth he knew had no home in that room. As he stepped back into the corridor, the laughter and denial followed him like ghosts. He understood with a clarity that chilled his bones that the empire would not believe until the bombs themselves rained down upon their cities. They would not trust the eyes of their spies, the voices of their allies, or even the numbers written in steel and fire. They would cling to their mythology of superiority until it crushed them beneath its weight. For Tanaka, the war had already shifted. The battlefield was no longer the Pacific. It was this chamber, these walls, these mines. And in that battle he had just witnessed defeat. Tanaka left the chamber with the sting of laughter still echoing in his ears, but history had no patience for pride. Within months, the battlefield itself delivered the verdict his superiors refused to hear. The numbers on his reports transformed into black shadows across the sky, an iron tide that swept over Europe and the Pacific alike. In February 1944, the Allies unleashed Operation Argument, what the men in the field came to call Big Week. For 6 days, the American 8th Air Force sent over 1,000 heavy bombers daily against the heart of German aircraft production. To the men on the ground, it seemed as though the heavens themselves had cracked open. The air filled with the droning thunder of engines so many that Luftwaffe pilots swore the sky itself trembled. Waves of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds stretched horizon to horizon, escorted by swarms of P-51 fighters that cut down interceptors like hawks, tearing through crows. German intelligence officers had warned this day would come. They had pleaded that the arithmetic of industry could not be denied. Yet Göring had laughed. Hitler had sneered. And when the storm arrived, their disbelief offered no shield. Entire factories were leveled in hours. Production lines stopped not because of sabotage or espionage, but because they lay buried under mountains of twisted steel and fire. German pilots, outnumbered 10-1, returned to bases where replacement planes never came. The reports Tanaka had carried through Tokyo's corridors now unfolded across Europe in burning reality. Intelligence had been correct, leadership had been catastrophically wrong, and the battlefield punished that arrogance with merciless precision. By June, the Allies proved the point again. D-Day dawned under the wings of more than 11,000 aircraft. Bombers, transports, gliders, fighters, all swarming in coordinated fury above Normandy. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could muster fewer than 300 fighters in response. The German sky turned silent not because their pilots lacked courage, but because their industry lacked breath. Every calculation Tanaka had presented months earlier now revealed itself in the smoke above French beaches. And the Pacific would not remain untouched. By late 1944, the B-29 superfortress brought America's industrial miracle directly to Japan's heart. Cities that had laughed at the idea of defeat now trembled as wave after wave of bombers carved fire into the night sky. Tokyo itself became an inferno, entire districts reduced to ash in hours. The truth that had been mocked in wood-paneled chambers now roared overhead, undeniable, relentless, searing its arithmetic into the very soil of the empire. Tanaka stood on the rooftop of the ministry one March night as the city burned. He watched flames leap higher than temple spires, saw civilians clawing through rubble, heard the screams of mothers searching for children. And above it all, he heard the drone, the steady, endless drone of engines. He knew that sound better than anyone. It was the voice of the reports he had tried to deliver, the voice of truth ignored. 300 bombers a month, he whispered bitterly, eyes fixed on the glowing horizon. You laughed. Now count them and fire. The Empire had dismissed the photographs as fabrications, the shipping manifests as exaggerations, the testimonies of spies as propaganda. But steel did not lie, nor did the bombs it carried. Reality had arrived in formation, tight and unyielding, delivering punishment for every denial uttered in marble halls. Across Europe, German generals cursed the blindness of their leaders. Galland, one of their greatest aces, confessed bitterly that he had counted more than 800 bombers in a single formation. They are real, he told Göring. And they are dropping real bombs. But Göring, who once mocked the very possibility, could only stare as his Air Force dissolved under the weight of arithmetic he had refused to believe. In Japan, the same blindness endured. Even as American raids grew in scale, high command clung to myths. They spoke of spirit triumphing over steel, of purity, conquering mongrel democracy. Yet the factories they boasted of lay silent, starved of resources, while American assembly lines roared without pause. By 1945, the skies above Japan belonged not to the Zero, but to the superfortress. Entire cities were erased in single nights, the product of factories that had once been dismissed as fantasies. Tanaka felt the cruel irony with every raid. His duty had been to present the truth. He had done so. But truth stripped of belief had no power. Only when it returned, clad in aluminum and fire, did it force recognition, and by then it was too late. The denial of his superiors had become a death sentence for millions. The contrast was unbearable: intelligence officers drowning in evidence, leadership suffocating in ideology. One offered survival, the other insisted on myth. On the battlefield, myth burned. Every raid, every formation of bombers overhead was a reminder. Intelligence had not failed. Belief had. Those who mocked the figures now crouched in bunkers, shielding their ears from the roar of engines they once denied. Those who sneered at the thought of Negroes and women riveting steel now buried their dead beneath rubble those same hands had created. The battlefield did not care for ideology. It cared only for production, for mathematics, for the cold truth of numbers given wings. Tanaka knew the lesson was larger than the war itself. To reject reality is to invite its vengeance. The laughter of his superiors had not drowned the truth. It had only delayed its arrival. And when truth came, it came, multiplied, magnified, unstoppable. As fire consumed Tokyo and steel crushed Berlin, the warning he had spoken in vain carved itself into history. The truth denied in chambers of power will always return louder, harder, unforgiving. The battlefield has no patience for arrogance. The day America's bombers darkened the skies, the verdict was rendered. Intelligence had been right, leadership had been wrong. And nations that confuse ideology with reality do not simply lose wars, they are destroyed by them. The firestorms faded, the guns fell silent, and the war ended not with a triumphant charge but with silence over ruined capitals and signatures inked on surrender documents. In that silence came reflection, bitter and raw. For those who had carried the burden of intelligence, the aftermath was not relief, but vindication soaked in tragedy. They had been right, the reports had been true, the numbers had been accurate. And yet millions were dead, because truth had been mocked, dismissed, and buried under ideology. Admiral Tanaka never forgot the day his warnings had been laughed out of the war room. In post-war interrogations, German and Japanese intelligence officers echoed the same refrain. We were not defeated because we lacked information. We were defeated because we lacked the courage to believe it. That single sentence became the gravestone of their entire intelligence apparatus. The Allies had not hidden their strength. They had flaunted it, boasted of it, even allowed foreigners to tour their factories. The information was there, laid bare, like daylight. The tragedy was not a failure of spies, but a failure of belief. Cognitive bias, the invisible prison of prejudice, had killed reason. The Nazis could not accept that women in overalls could outwork their master craftsmen. Japanese commanders could not believe that a democracy of immigrants, Negroes, women, and teenagers could weld together the most advanced machines of destruction in history. They did not reject the numbers because the numbers were wrong. They rejected them because the numbers shattered their worldview. That is the first and cruelest lesson. Bias blinds more effectively than any enemy deception. Facts that contradict ideology are often cast aside as lies, while lies that comfort ideology are embraced as truth. In Berlin and Tokyo, men with medals and maps laughed at the arithmetic of factories, preferring the myth of racial superiority. On the battlefield, arithmetic triumphed. The second lesson was carved in steel, and blood: ideology cannot conquer reality. Hitler could declare that Americans were mongrels, weak, incapable of discipline. Japanese generals could preach that spirit outweighed steel, that purity would overcome production. But the bombs that leveled Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo were not built by ideology. They were built by machines, operated by free men and women, trained in weeks, united not by myth, but by necessity. Numbers do not bend to speeches. Mathematics does not salute flags. The weight of production crushed the fantasies of empire with merciless consistency. And then there was the third lesson, the one history has struggled to admit: democracy, mocked as weak, revealed itself as strong beyond measure. For the first time in modern history, an industrial power mobilized not just its soldiers, but its entire people. Women who had never set foot in factories became Rosie the Riveters, driving rivets into wings and fuselages. African Americans, often denied dignity in their own land, ran lathes and presses that forged parts for bombers. Teenagers carried blueprints. Disabled workers managed logistics. It was not homogeneity but diversity that powered the arsenal of democracy. The very thing dictators called weakness became the foundation of strength. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, admitted it after the war in his cell at Nuremberg. If we had accepted the truth of Willow Run and Boeing, he said, we might have sued for peace in 1943 and spared millions of lives. But to accept it was to admit that everything we believed about democracy and race was wrong, and no one dared tell Hitler that. His words echoed the silent despair of every intelligence officer who had watched truth ignored until bombs proved it real. For Tanaka, the personal wound ran deeper. In the war's aftermath, he was questioned by American officers who asked why Japan had not listened. His answer was simple, bitter. Because we were trained to believe we were right, even when the evidence screamed otherwise. He remembered the sound of laughter in the chamber, the smug dismissal of facts, the cruel joke that women and Negroes could build bombers. He remembered the night Tokyo burned when that joke turned to fire raining from the sky. The legacy of that failure outlived the men themselves. Historians came to call it one of the greatest intelligence collapses in history, not a failure of collection, but a failure of acceptance. In classrooms and war colleges, the story was told again and again. Germany and Japan drowned in accurate intelligence they refused to believe. The phrase, "we were not defeated for lack of information," became a warning carved into doctrine, a reminder that arrogance is as deadly as ignorance. And yet beyond the military lessons, there was something profoundly human that emerged. In 1985, at the dedication of the Yankee Air Museum at Willow Run, an aging Rosie the Riveter, named Rose Will Monroe, met a former Luftwaffe pilot who had once flown against the formations she helped build. The man stooped and gray, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "How did you build so many so fast?" he asked. Monroe smiled softly, her hands now too frail to hold the rivet gun she once wielded with precision. "Honey," she said, "we just went to work every day and did our job. Nothing fancy. Just punch in, build bombers, punch out. Democracy isn't complicated. It's just free people doing their best." The German pilot lowered his eyes. "We were told democracy made you weak. We were told your diversity made you inefficient. We were told lies. And those lies killed millions." That exchange, quiet and almost tender, spoke more powerfully than any report or statistic. It revealed the ultimate irony: the truth was never hidden, never secret. It was as simple as a woman tying a scarf around her hair, stepping onto a factory floor and doing her part. The dictators, with all their spies and propaganda, could not comprehend such simplicity. They sought secrets, conspiracies, tricks. They missed the truth in plain sight. Democracy works because people work. The lessons lingered in every corner of the post-war world. Intelligence agencies rewrote their doctrines, emphasizing the danger of cognitive bias. Economists studied the miracle of American production, recognizing that freedom of participation multiplied capacity beyond authoritarian imagination. And politicians, at least for a time, acknowledged that truth must be faced even when it is uncomfortable. But the legacy was not only strategic, it was moral. The war had proven that lies can build armies, but they cannot build victory. Myths can inspire parades, but they cannot produce steel. Only truth accepted and acted upon can endure. The refusal to believe truth when it contradicts ideology is not merely an error, it is a crime against one's own people, for it leads them blind into catastrophe. Tanaka, in his final years, wrote a private reflection never intended for publication. In it, he recalled the reports he had carried, the numbers he had recited, the laughter he had endured. "The Americans built their strength in daylight," he wrote. "We blinded ourselves in darkness. The reports told us everything. We chose to believe nothing, and in that choice lay the death of an empire." His words captured the essence of the legacy. Intelligence is worthless if those in power refuse to believe it. Numbers mean nothing if ideology denies them, and a nation that rejects reality will eventually be destroyed by it. The ruins of Berlin, the ashes of Tokyo, the endless cemeteries of Europe and Asia, all bore witness to that lesson. Truth ignored becomes tragedy. At the close of her life, Rose Monroe was interviewed once more. Her voice was weaker, her hands unsteady, but her words were the same. "We just went to work every day and did our job," she said. And somewhere in the quiet beyond history, the ghosts of intelligence officers, who had once counted bombers in secret reports, must have nodded in bitter agreement. They had seen the arithmetic of freedom. They had tried to shout its truth, and they had been drowned by laughter. In the end, the legacy of Willow Run and Boeing of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds was not only that democracy could outproduce dictatorships, it was that democracy could outlast them because it trusted ordinary people. The dictators placed their faith in myths. The democracies placed their faith in workers, and in that faith lay the fate of the world. When historians sum up the intelligence failure of the Axis, they often write in cold language of numbers, figures, and reports. But the human truth is simpler, starker. In one corner of the world, men in uniforms mocked reality. In another, women in overalls embraced it. And in the clash between myth and mathematics, between arrogance and labor, the free world prevailed. That is, the diadem, and the warning history leaves behind. Reality does not bend to ideology. Mathematics does not yield to myth. And the strength of democracy is the strength of its people. Ignore these truths, and tragedy will follow. Believe them, and the world can be built anew, one rivet, one worker, one truth at a time.